Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri livestock economist Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
All right, as we get into this week, finally some USDA reports for us to talk about, and we'll talk a little markets and trade as well. But as we get things started this week, looking at the markets, how did we end up?
Yeah, if we start on the cattle side of the equation this week, fed cattle prices up nearly 90 cents for the week, while when we look at feeder cattle prices, we were actually steady to 3 lower for this week. On the futures side, April live cattle futures contract closed up $1.30 this week, while that March feeder cattle futures contract closed up $1.60. If we look at the beef side, the choice box beef price was virtually unchanged from a week ago, but that still is good as we move through 2019 because that's nearly $8.50 above where we were a year ago at this time. So a lot of strength there. If we look at the pork side, barrel and gilt prices, we were 65 cents lower on cash barrel and gilt prices this week. While if we look at that April lean hog futures contract, it was down $1.30. If you look over the last 3 weeks, that's more than a $7.50 decline in that April lean hog futures contract. So we've seen a lot of lower movement in terms of pork prices. On the pork cutout value, we were down nearly $2 this week. Really had a lot of weakness across the board in many cuts, but ham certainly stick out as being lower this week. And that leaves that pork cutout value more than $11 below where it was a year ago at this time. So very different in terms of what we see going on the pork side versus beef at this point in time.
Scott, when we take a closer look at those pork numbers specifically, is it kind of, I hate the term a perfect storm, but really a little bit of a perfect storm between trade concerns? There's big supplies. We've seen these heavier hog weights, all of this adding in, and we're still looking at demand and hoping that it at least maintains at this point.
Yeah, so I certainly think that when you look at just what's been large supplies of hogs that we've had and pork that we've had on the marketplace, we keep hoping, I think, that the trade side gets better for us, yet we continue to see tariffs on products going to Mexico as well as those products going to China. So there hasn't been a lot of positive on the trade side. And then all of a sudden you have to talk about more domestic demand for pork taking up the slack or domestic consumption. And I think that's just made it a lot tougher for these pork markets out of the gate in 2019.
Do we also, when we talk about the domestic demand situation, we know things are good right now, but are we like one bad economic growth quarter away from things falling off a little bit and adding even more pressure to prices?
Yeah, so Megan, I think you hit the nail on the head that we have to have strong economic growth continue for all of 2019, probably critical for both pork and beef prices as we move ahead. But that might be the last straw that creates a situation that none of us would like to see, is for that domestic economy to start to slow. And I think on the pork side, we've had a lot of positive expectations about what African swine fever in China means for U.S. pork markets. And, maybe we're still waiting to see the real benefits of some of that at this point. And again, I'm not saying African swine fever won't be a big market mover in 2019 as we get into the year, but it's certainly been slow to this point, I think, in terms of at least allowing us to talk about more trade.
All right, USDA supply and demand report came out today. As we take a look at that number, and really it's the first look we've had at anything since the end of 2018. Talk to me a little bit about at first glance what we take from the report, and then let's get into some of those other numbers a little bit.
Yeah, I guess for me at first glance, I was like, whew, not as much change as I might have anticipated, given, and that's not being critical of USDA when I say that, but one worries when we've missed now, but basically 60 days of reports when it comes to WASDE, that we'd see some big changes in the February report relative to what we got in December. And I guess my first blush, not a lot of change really relative to where we were at in December. So I don't know that it's a big market mover in terms of the effects thus far.
So overall, or at least at first look, not a lot of changes. But when you dig in to that report, USDA did pull back their expansion in meat production for 2019. Is that a little bit of something, maybe a nugget that the livestock sector can hold on to?
I think absolutely it is. We'll see how this all unfolds. But if you look at from December to February, USDA did reduce 2019 beef, pork, and chicken consumption by a little more than 700 million pounds. That's a good substantial reduction in the growth. Now let's make sure we remind ourselves we're talking about a reduction in the growth, not a decline in those three meat productions in total for 2019. And yet USDA didn't do a lot on the export side. So exports from December to February, they didn't change those estimates much, which really means that domestic availability went down roughly 1.5 pounds from December to February. So we just talked about, we're going to be talking about more meat on the market. And even with that reduction, we still are talking about another roughly 3 pounds or so, a little shy of 3 pounds of domestic availability. But that's better than 4.5 pounds of growth in 2019. So maybe that gives us a little bit of help in terms of, stronger prices as we look in 2019.
So does it really kind of set up the stage that our growth will continue to slow?
It sure seems like we're seeing some signs of slowing production relative to maybe what we would have thought earlier. I'm not ready to call that completely in the books for 2019 at this point. However, I do think that some of the lower returns that we faced in both the beef and pork sides in 2018 has made these industries think twice about their expansion plans.
All right, monthly trade data. The USDA released its trade data or released trade data this week, but it's not for recent weeks. It's actually November's information. So as we take a look at that, what do we need to pull from November's monthly trade data?
Yeah, so first of all, roughly a month behind in terms of when November would have normally come out. We have a tale of two cities here in terms of trade data for sure. If you look at beef exports in November, quantity-wise up 1% from a year ago, yet value was up 6%. So some pretty good news on the beef side. When you look at that value of beef exports, just the first 11 months of 2018 exceeded the record level of calendar 2017 already. So 2018 is a really good year for the beef side, and hopefully that continues as we move into 2019. A little different story on the pork side, which is really not surprising. A lot of those key markets that we focus on, Mexico, China, continue to have tariffs. But when you look at November pork exports, they were down 8% year over year, while in value terms, they fell 12%. That's, I think, part of what's been at play and what's been some lower pork prices as well.
We'll continue to have some reports to talk about. We know that USDA has a schedule up, but how nervous do we get? I mean, we're really only a week away from another potential shutdown if they don't get things under wraps.
Yeah, so a few things here I think is important. Number one, it's going to take USDA several weeks, probably before they get all caught up from the shutdown that we just went through. And I'm not, again, the longest shutdown ever. It will take a while to come out of getting all those reports caught up. But if we were not to get an agreement by February 15th, and we do talk about another shutdown, so much for their planning in terms of getting caught back up from the previous one. So there is some concern there. And I don't know at the end of the day whether we get an agreement done or not. But if we don't, for you and I talking about meat markets, it just leaves us with less information moving forward, which I continue to worry about, just as we're seeing some weakness in pork prices. How does the market try to anticipate what's been happening with the lack of public data?
Specifically, that cattle on feed, which is supposed to come out on the 22nd, and cattle inventory, which would come out then on the 28th, should everything stay open and going. Yeah.
So a couple of things I'll say. So for me on the cattle report, I assume USDA is in the midst of doing survey work for that cattle report to come out at the end of the month. So if they were to shut down, at least the survey work's done. And so maybe it can get released fairly soon after any kind of shutdown might happen again. That's a big report for me, so how many beef cows we really have. You get mixed signals as you go around the country in terms of what's been happening to beef cow inventory in the country. I think some states like Missouri that's seen a lot of drought issues has been worried about whether we've been growing cow numbers, while some of the Southeast saw better weather in 2018. I expect there's expansion going on there. So we'll see the net effect of all those things in that report. So critical as we look for the remainder of 2019, and as well what's been happening in feed yards. We know we've slowed down probably growth with some of the weather issues that we face. Just how large of supplies do we have sitting in those feed yards, and how does that set the stage as we go through 2019?
Scott, I think that's it for us this week. As we look ahead to next week, what reports are we watching for?
Yeah, so a couple reports next week. We'll get a little more focused on the domestic side of the picture again, with retail prices coming out midweek next week, as well as a consumer confidence report at the end of next week.
Well, we will talk to you next Friday. Hopefully also not talking about another government shutdown, and to see where things go from there. And then cattle on feed and cattle inventory are our next big ones.
That sounds great, Megan.
All right. To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe. You can also submit questions and comments. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.